What's coming up for you today in the All Things Book Show? I believe everybody has a story to tell. So let's take a look at it.
Welcome to the All Things Books Show, hosted by award-winning best-selling mystery author Dawn Brookes. Publishing has changed beyond recognition in recent years. Join Dawn as she interviews authors, narrators, and many more from across the creative community. This inspiring and informative show is for readers and writers.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the All Things Book Show. And this week we're going to talk about how to write a memoir. Have you ever thought how many people, well, if I had £1 for every time somebody had said to me, I'd love to write my story, or my grandmother's got a great story, she did this, that and the other during the war while growing up, or this person suffered abuse. I know somebody about somebody who was kidnapped and kept locked away for 10, 12 years. Your story might not be quite as radical as that, but nevertheless, I believe everybody has a story to tell. So let's take a look at it. Okay, with that out of the way, we are going to look this week at how to write a memoir. Well, who am I? I write cozy mysteries. I write crime fiction. So who am I to tell you how to write a memoir? Well, in case you didn't know, my very first book that I published was a memoir. Hurry Up Nurse, Memoirs of Nurse Training in the 1970s is my memoir. And then I went on to write book 2. It's been recovered now. It's got a different cover to that. And also book 3, which I can't lay my hands on at the minute. I don't know why. It's because I'm moving offices. This is not my office. This is my dining room, but I've got a new office and I'll be in it shortly. But you don't want to know about that. You want to know how to write a memoir. So before we launch into how to write a memoir, let's look at what a memoir is. What is it you want to write? Do you want to write a memoir or an autobiography? What motivates you to want to write your story? Worth thinking about before you decide on putting it down on paper. You might need to identify a niche. You will definitely need to plan your memoir, but we're going to look at all that. So let's have a look. Let's start with, what is a memoir? Well, a memoir, as opposed to an autobiography, is one aspect of your life. You might not have thought about that before. It might be you're thinking of writing your whole life story or somebody else's whole life story. Well, if that's the case, you're writing an autobiography if it's about you, or a biography if it's about somebody else. But if you're just writing about one aspect of your life or their life, then that is a memoir. And the theme of a memoir is that it's shared through memories and anecdotes, and obviously you still want to make it an exciting story. Whereas an autobiography or a biography is chronological. It starts at birth, it goes through growth right into the present. I'm sorry about these slides, but if I enlarge the screen, you'll be able to see them. But I'm sure you'd rather see me, wouldn't you? So if you're the sort of person who wants to pause this video and stop for a moment, and you want to write on a post-it sheet, what is your motivation for writing your own or someone else's memoir? Pause the video now, do that exercise and come back. There are many motivations and reasons for writing a memoir. Mine initially was just to put my nurse training down on record for, say, future generations who might be doing a family tree, and they'll find out, oh, we had this aunt or this great aunt or this great aunt. You know what I mean. You know where I'm going. Who was a nurse. And she wrote this book all about her time of nursing in the 1970s. And then she went on and wrote another one because she moved to London. So she wanted to tell them about her training at the London Chest Hospital, which no longer exists, I might add. My wonderful London Chest Hospital, they've knocked it down and are making flats and houses out of it. But hey, I can't go on about that too much, otherwise we'd never get through this video. And then she went on and wrote number 3 because she moved somewhere else and did some more training. So she wrote 3. And who knows, by the time I've finished, I might have written 4, 5, 6. Who knows? I did spend 39 years as a nurse, so there's plenty of stories to tell. And the first 3 books only talk about my initial training in the 1970s and early 1980s. So, there might be more to come. That was a very long winded way of saying what I was going to do. Well, I was writing initially for personal experience, posterity, and family. And would you believe that when I self-published this memoir, after I self-published it, it actually became hugely popular and has been successful if I compare it to what traditional publishers consider a non-fiction book to be in relation to success. And they say if you've sold more than 10,000 copies, you are a success. Well, I am definitely a success because I've sold way more than 10,000 copies of that memoir. And it's still, to this day, 6 years later, it is still one of the bestseller in one of its categories in the United States. So it's very popular in the United States, and it's also popular in the United Kingdom. So I do sell a lot of copies, consistent number of copies of that memoir. So who knows, you might decide it's for personal, but then you publish it or self-publish it, or you find a publisher and you end up making a little bit of money out of it. Why not? You might be writing a memoir just as a branding for your running a business. It might be that you're considering that you sell something that you set up in business, and you might want to tell people how you got to where you are today. And it also gives you a little bit of street cred if you've got oh, by the way, I've written a book about this. Say you're a property developer. Are you one of the few who's written a book about it? I've written a book about property development or buy to let or something like that. You might want to use your memoir to teach something. Obviously, it lends itself to teach something. You can teach something. You might be wanting, for instance, to help people through some personal trauma that you've been through, or some training that you went through. It might be there's all manner of things you can teach through a memoir without preaching. And that's why people love memoirs. You might actually, as we said earlier, you might be writing it to publish. And if you are, there are certainly some things that you need to consider when you publish that memoir. You might be writing it for somebody else. You might be ghostwriting it for somebody else. Somebody else knows that you can write, that you're good at writing. Not that you need to be good at writing. You just need to be able to tell your story, and then we'll come on to how you would structure that later on. But you might be wanting to ghostwrite somebody else's story, so your name doesn't go on it, their name goes on it. Or you might be a co-author. So just one of the considerations you need to think about: do you need to be famous? If you want to sell a memoir, do you need to be famous? Well, yes and no. It's easier to sell a memoir if you're famous, obviously, because as you know, Michelle Obama didn't have to try very hard to sell her memoir, and neither does a top-rate football player or tennis player or anybody like that who's been successful. For instance, they can easily find a publisher and sell a memoir. It's easier for them, but that doesn't mean that people aren't interested in your story, or grandma so-and-so's story, or granddad's story, who survived the trenches, or anything like that, or even just how you got through childbirth, a horrendous childbirth, or how you got through a horrendous pregnancy, or how you got through abuse, etc. We'll come on to all these things, but people are interested in your story, particularly if you make it interesting. So let's go back to having a look. So there are various niches that are popular with people when you're writing a memoir. And obviously, if you've been a carer like I was, or you're in medical, you're in nursing, you were a lawyer, teacher, train driver, counsellor, vicar, sportsman, or woman, etc. Any of those niches can be interesting for people who want to read about it. War, obviously, again, is very popular with people. If you want to talk about experiences during World War One, World War Two, the Gulf Wars, Afghanistan, and I've already seen war stories coming out of the Ukraine, of what people are going through right now as we speak, as I record this video. So growing up in Russia, for instance, growing up in China, all sorts of niches that you can talk about in a memoir. Conflict, obviously, similar to war, is people find interesting. Growing up in Ireland, what it was like during the Troubles, Spain, either past, present, or possibly what might happen in the future. Everybody loves a love story. So if you've got a nice or a lovely romantic story with an edge, people are gonna really like those. Say you loved and lost. Cross-cultural love stories are popular. Obviously, other love stories, rags to riches story. You might have a rags to riches, or you might even have a riches to rags story. Did you win the lottery and lose it all? Well, that is a story that people want to read. They want to see how you blew that money and how could you and what they would have done in your shoes. So there's lots of stories like that. Dolly Parton's got a rags to riches. Elvis Presley was rags to riches. Didn't do him a lot of good, unfortunately, in the end. But people love those stories. Another niche is addiction. Were you an addict? Did you grow up with parents who were addicts? Did you mess about at school and was your best friend an addict? Have you had children yourself while being an addict and then come off drugs for their good, etc.? Anything like that, people are interested in. And you've got a story to tell. If you have a difficult background and you've learned to be happy, you've overcome your background. People love empowering stories. For somebody who's going through hell at the minute, if you can tell them how you overcame, people love that sort of thing. And also, you're helping people. You're not just trying to make money, you're trying to help people by putting into words your memoir. Even if you've got a very ordinary story to tell, your ordinary story is actually probably more interesting than you think. If you start to, even while watching this video, pause it or afterwards think about, well, actually, that time in my life, that was really interesting. That time you traveled, you spent 3 months traveling through Asia. I did that, and I'm currently writing a memoir of that time. Travel stories are interesting for people. You would be surprised at how interesting your life really is if you dig down into the nitty gritty. There might be one part of your life where, something significant happened that's worth putting on paper. You might want to tell a story from a different viewpoint. There are German memoirs out there of how they suffered during the war, which obviously some normal, ordinary German families did suffer. And not everybody was a Nazi. You might have a religious story to tell. You were missionaries in a certain part of the world, or your parents were missionaries, or your grandparents were missionaries, and some of the things that they went through and their beliefs and how strong and what was it that made them so determined that they to tell people about their beliefs, that they traveled the length and breadth of the world, putting themselves at risk, some of them even dying, to tell people what it was they believed in. Those sorts of, and some of the best stories I've ever read are missionary stories. Travel memoir we've already mentioned. You may have been to far-flung parts of the world, or even climbed Kilimanjaro or Everest. Your experience of climbing Everest will be different to somebody else's experience of climbing Everest. And for those people who would love to climb Everest but never could, they want to see how you read about how you did it. You might have lived through a local event such as an earthquake. School kid bullies, all sorts of personal stories there would be wonderful. We've all just lived through a pandemic. What was your experience of that pandemic? I mean, obviously, it's been hell for us for 2 years. It might be you don't want to write about it yet, but maybe it's worth penning some of the things that you went through during that time for history, because in future generations they're going to have no clue what it was like to live in this pandemic. And I just before the pandemic actually bought a book called Pandemic, which was about the 1918 pandemic, and very interesting it was too. So people in 30, 50 years, maybe longer, maybe shorter, will want to know about your experiences. But if you worked in health, or the emergency services, or were a carer in a care home, your story might be something people want to read about now, and it might actually be cathartic for you to write that story, and that may be your only reason for writing it, not to certainly make money out of the current pandemic. I don't think anyone would feel comfortable doing that, although some people have. But you might just want to write your story and tell people what it was like. If people want to buy it, you can always donate the money to charity. An interesting one: sex slaves, prostitution, modern slavery. There's a lot of people going through that at the minute. Maybe you've been through it in the past. Maybe you were brought up in a country where, or still, and live in a country where you have been sold as a sex slave, or you know somebody who has. And again, people not necessarily people want to know how you survive. How do you get through? What is it that makes you get up in the morning and survive, live through another day? And of course, very popular are animals. So you can have an animal memoir. Was there a special animal in your life that did something special, or that that helped you through something? If you say had a disability, did that has that animal saved your life? The topics are endless. So it could be. So if you're thinking about it, and has any of those struck a chord in you, or maybe you think, well, mine's different, Dawn. It's more about this time in my life, and I just want to put it into writing. Do that. Write your memoir from your perspective, even if it's only your own family who wants to hear about it. Somebody wants to read about it. I wish sincerely that my mum, who died far too young, I have to say, which is tragic, I wish I had something from her side of the family that somebody had written that would help me to know her and her family better. So, having considered that, what part have you thought about it now? Pause the video if you need to. What part of your life would you like to write about? Perhaps like me, you were a nurse. You want to write about your nurse training. It would have been different to mine. Even if it was in the same hospital at the same time, your experiences would have been different. The people you cared for would have been different. Were you a policeman, a carer, a school dinner lady, a teacher, any of these things? And you got experiences that you want to talk about in a memoir? So we've thought about what you want to write, but the next thing you need to think about and you want to think about is, who are you writing for? Like I said right at the beginning, is it just for your family, for posterity, or are you writing to sell the book because you want readers to read it? Now, I'm a great memoir reader. I love memoirs. I don't care if you are a cleaner or someone famous. I love reading stories about other people's lives, because basically we're nosy, aren't we? I'm nosy. Why do we rub a neck when we go past an accident on the motorway? Is it because we're really concerned about the people in the accident? Of course we are. We are. But we're also inherently nosy. We want to know what it's like behind the closed doors or the closed windows and the closed curtains of our neighbours. We want to know. In fact, my neighbours love my memoirs. They feel that they know me better than they know any of their friends, because they've read my memoirs. Although obviously it's only a certain part of my life. But yeah, who is your audience? And what's in it for them? Even if you're writing a memoir, whether it's for your own family or to sell, you still want a hook. You want something that makes your particular story worth picking up and reading, because only the most dedicated relative will read a whole load of notes that don't make any sense and are not ordered in any way, shape, or form. Once you've decided on who your audience is, whether it's just for posterity or whether you want to sell it, you need to make that book relevant. That manuscript, that short story, it might only be this thick, it might be as thick as mine. Have you got a lot to say? But even if you've got a lot to say, make sure you say it in a way that's concise and don't ramble, and make it unique. Because obviously the reason many people pick up a book, a memoir, is because it's unique, it's different. What I'm suggesting you do now again is pause this video, leave this on the screen, and think about some of the memories that you might want to include in your memoir, but you must include them with caution, because otherwise it's becoming an autobiography. And unless you're very famous, people really don't want to know about the average Joe blog's birth right through to current day. But there might be issues and things, or your memoir might even be about one of these things, but there might certainly be issues that made you who you are today, or made you make the decision to do what you did. These are things that you can include, but be cautious about. So your childhood, be specific about your childhood. Make it's got to be relevant to the memoir you're writing. Don't tell them, I started school when I was 3 and I went to so and so and I played with so and so and I did this and that. I mean, yes, by all means, record those facts for posterity, but you don't really want to put them in a memoir that you're writing as a book. Even for posterity, it's best to keep it concise. You might want to talk about your school, teenage years, first love, college, university, boyfriends, girlfriends, career, ambition, marriage, the children you've had, but please don't go on about, I had little Joey and he first started crawling at the age of 6 months and da-di-da-di-da. Yes, that's all great. Do those landmarks, etc. Don't put it all in a memoir. Gap years, any regrets that you have, anger, pets that meant something, grandchildren, dreams, failures and successes. What not to do in a memoir, if you don't want to alienate people, that is. Let your experiences get the message across of what you're trying to say. You don't need to preach at people. Tell your story in an interesting way. People will take your lead. Don't vent your anger at someone, or if you're going to, make sure that that someone cannot be identified. Be careful when you use real names to get permission. If you're going to use real names, I couldn't use real names of patients anyway because I'm bound by confidentiality. So I changed them and I changed details and changed all sorts of things. And even my friends, I asked them first whether I could use their names, and I couldn't. If I couldn't contact them, I didn't use their real names. I changed them. Don't defame people in a memoir. But don't gloss over the surface. Do be real and do go into the nitty gritty. But if you're going to go into the nitty gritty that throws someone under a bus, make sure you have disguised yourself and them. So, okay, we've talked a little bit here about what to do, what not to do. Now let's think about how you write it. And the important thing about even a memoir is you need to be structured about it. When I wrote this first book, Hurry Up Nurse, Memoirs of Nurse Training, I mean, it wasn't my best, actually, to be honest, when I first wrote it. And I've since revised it and republished it. But with each chapter has a theme. So chapter 1 starts the interview, 1977. That was the interview that was going to change my life. So I felt it was quite important to put that right at the beginning. Now, there might have been something that sparked off what it was that you did that set the whole train in motion. So brainstorm the things that are really important that you want to get down on paper. After writing about the interview, I did go back and write about simple beginnings and wrote a short chapter on where I came from, and then a chapter on the call and why I began nursing in the first place, and what it was, what jobs I did that made me start nursing. But they are brief. When I first wrote the book in the first edition, I put far too much detail. And obviously, my old friends and again my neighbours, they were very interested to know the nitty gritty. But the average reader is not. They don't know me. I'm not famous. I'll never be famous. I don't want to be famous. So they did not need to know about every friend that I made at school. You know, I'm probably exaggerating, but I included far too much, and it was itsy bitsy and all over the place because I hadn't learned to structure my writing. So don't make the same mistake. Learn to structure your writing and your thoughts. And what I suggest you do is you brainstorm exactly the bits that you think would fit into a chapter, and then challenge yourself to come up with chapter headings for those chapters, and then think about, is that bit really relevant? How long is it going to be? I don't want it to be so long that I'm going to lose people who might be interested in the story that I'm trying to tell, but they're not going to be interested in my life. If you're writing an autobiography for posterity, by all means include a bit more, but don't try and publish it. And then obviously the thing I then moved on to, having started nursing, was nurse training. And then what I did, because I was telling about my training, I actually split it into wards and experiences, and that really helped me. So it started off with orthopedics, and I did medicine and surgical and A&E and all the different things that came back to me in each of those places, so that it made short, concise chapters, but then included patient stories, because actually, as well as the historical aspect of nursing in the 1970s and all the horrible ogre sisters, and some of them very nice, of course, they wanted to hear also about my experiences, how I grew and developed as an 18-year-old. Seeing death for the first time and all those things, but they also wanted to know about the patients and what they went through, and how some of them overcame and how relatives overcame when things didn't go so well. So that's how I did it. Now, obviously, that's straightforward because I was writing about nurse training and it was very structured. So I could put it into that structured way. But you can do that too. If you think about what is it, what are those key bits of my job, my life that I want to put down on paper? It's really good exercise to come up with chapter headings because your chapter headings need to hook people. Say I was just flicking through the book and I saw, ooh, that looks really interesting, that chapter. That might be enough to make me buy the book. Obviously, the title is interesting, and you can either come up with that right at the beginning or you can come up with later. I suggest if you can come up with it at the beginning because it gives you direction, and having a direction rather than, and don't try not to come up with some obscure title that you think's really clever but nobody else has got a clue what you mean. What do you mean by that? Hurry up, nurse. Memoirs of nurse training in the 1970s. That about sums it up. This nurse is rushed off her feet and it's based in the 1970s. That tells you everything you need to know about this book before you even think about it. This one, Hurry Up Nurse 2, as I say, it's been recovered, but Hurry Up Nurse 2, London Calling. That tells you everything you need to know. This is a book about London. And then if you look at the back of the book, it'll tell you that it's set in the 1980s on a heart and chest ward. Your title will not only help readers to know what you're talking about, it'll help you to keep to a structure. And as I say, try not to be too clever with it because you might end up regretting it. Because if people don't know what your book is about, if you think about, I'm not, again, if you're wanting to sell this book, if people are scrolling through an Amazon page or a bookstore, if you're lucky enough to get it in a bookstore, or you're sending it to an agent, they want to know immediately, just from the title, what is that book about? And then once you get down to the writing, this is where you need to be a little bit clever, being creative with your writing. And there's a thing, I did an MA in creative writing, but I knew this before because I'd read lots of books when I started writing fiction. And there's a thing called show, don't tell. And that means that you don't just want to tell people what's going on all the time. You've read those sorts of, dare I say, slightly boring memoirs that I would probably still plough through because I've got a story to tell. But here's an example. The night sister walked onto the ward and told me to join her for the ward round. Yeah, that is what happened. But what if I said it in this way? The sound of clopping heels reverberating off the marble floor outside the ward filled me with dread. As I heard the night sister's rapid approach, the knot in my stomach told me it was time for the ward round. Now, that is actually true. Every nurse on night duty at that time dreaded those footsteps not because they didn't like the night sister. The night sister might have been lovely, but I mean, some of them were dragons, of course they were. But even if they were the nicest in the world, you had to walk them round. Even if it was on your first night on duty, you had to walk them round. You'll read all about it in my very first book where I talk about night duty. You had to walk them around a Nightingale ward with 40 patients, and you had to know every single name and every single diagnosis, and you had to do it without looking at notes. You started duty at 9:30. You were lucky if the night sister left it till midnight. She would usually use it till after the drug round. But do you think you had a lot of time to learn all those patients' names and diagnoses if you'd just come on duty after 7 nights on? No, you didn't. But what made you learn it? Fear. Fear. And as I say, that knot in your stomach when they walked through that blooming door, you had to know it was fear. But whatever the reason, it makes for compelling storytelling. And I'm sure you've had the same experience in whatever it is that you want to tell your story about. So I would suggest, again, if you wish, pausing this video and spend some time right now writing one paragraph like that in a show, don't tell format, as if you were starting your memoir. I could go on about this all day. This could be a whole day session. You could do a day of workshops. Who knows? Might do it one day. I might even write a course on it to help people. This is only touching the surface. You realise that. So we're now going to look at you've done the show, don't tell. You've done the sorts of things that you want to include in the sense of chapter headings and things that you might want to use with caution. Now let's look at what needs to, even though it's not fiction, there are still some elements that you need to include in a memoir. Dialogue is one. If you can recall conversations, and we all can, if we sit down long enough and think about what it is that we're wanting to write about, and if it's that important that we want to write it in a memoir or an autobiography, then we will remember some conversations. If you're a diarist, you've already made the start. You've got it all written down there. You've got piles of diaries, probably too much information, but you can pull out some dialogue from that. And certainly, even now, at the end of this video, or if you want to think about writing your memoir, sit yourself down and write down the conversations that you can remember that are going to be really important to your memoir. You want to use good description, use adjectives. Don't just be boring in the way you write. If you're not a writer, that's okay. There are thesauruses out there which will tell you about adjectives and what are the best ones for particular words. So it can be done. And there are editors, and we'll go on to that later, because you'll need to pay an editor, ideally, if you want to write a decent book. You want to include conflict, be it within yourself or with other people. Include that conflict, include tension, include anecdotes. Be sparing with them. Don't go on and on and on. But yeah, include anecdotes. People love anecdotes. Include emotion, how you were feeling, how they were feeling, how you made someone else feel, what you suffered. Be as open as you possibly can, because people don't want to read about a robot. Otherwise, they'd be reading about a robot. They want to read about a human being who thinks, feels, and has experienced things, and all the emotions that go with those experiences. Don't leave, whether you're an open person or a closed person, if you really don't want to reveal your soul, use a pen name to write your memoir and reveal your soul. And then also you want to include pacing. It still need, although it's not fiction, you still need people to have a reason to turn the pages at the end of each chapter, and end each chapter, if you can, either on a resolution or on something that makes someone say, I need to read what happens next in this story, particularly if your story is a gripping experience of some form of tragedy, personal tragedy. Be real. Don't be an ultimatum. Show your vulnerability. Show your personality. If you're a humorous person, tell jokes. Show it that it was funny. Hurry Up Nurse is, in parts it's laugh out loud, and in other parts it's have a tissue handy because this is really sad. Show who you are in your personality and how you deal with things. So tell jokes. If you swear, swear. But if you don't swear, don't try and swear for the sake of swearing. It's really not clever. And if you can tell your story without swearing, and because you don't swear, then tell it. And I read This Is Going to Hurt by Adam Kay. I'm sure Adam won't mind me saying I felt that some of his language sometimes was inappropriate in the book, unnecessary. But if that's who he is, although he's not like that when he's on TV, but if that's who he is and he does swear a lot in his personal life, then you have to include that, whether someone like me likes that or not. Because actually, who am I? Of all the thousands of reviewers who have put his book to #1 bestseller in medical for years. I'm just one person with one opinion. So be real and build the narrative as you go along. As I've said earlier, you might want to throw someone off the bus, but it's better if you disguise that character if you are going to do it. You really should not. You do not want to end up in a libel case, or with. I mean, okay, you can tell the truth in a memoir, but just be cautious about using people's names, particularly if you are going to put them in a bad light and you don't want to end up being in court for defamation. But you can, if something really happened and that person really caused it. I'm not a lawyer. I would talk to a lawyer first, but you might want to risk it. And certainly, if it's just for family members to read, you might want to say that Uncle Joe was a right. Get release forms signed if you're using real names. Just phoning someone up and saying, "Can I use your name?" Oh yeah, and then they read the story and think, "I don't like the way she put that. That wasn't." I don't remember it like that, or for whatever reason, you just want a release form to say they said you could use this person said you could use the real name, or just use a pseudonym, and actually make sure that if you're in a profession where confidentiality is important, as I was in a nursing profession, that you don't use real names at all of patients or people within your care. Include a disclaimer at the front of the book that you've changed names, situations, circumstances. And as I say, don't hide the bad bits, but disguise the people responsible. It's just better to do it that way if you can. And what I've got in the beginning of mind, this book is a work of non-fiction based on the author's experiences in order to protect privacy. Names, identifying factors, dialogue and details have been changed or reconstructed. It can be simple like that, or it can be lengthy and more detailed. There are certain things you want to avoid, mistakes that you want to avoid. One of them is poor structure, as I've already alluded to earlier on. If your book is poorly structured, as my first one was, people are forgiving, particularly if your memoir is interesting. And I have to say that readers were very forgiving to me for the poorly structured first attempt that I put out there. And it always averaged 4.4, 4.5 stars in reviews. But some people will be upset by poor structure and poor grammar and punctuation and all the rest of it, and typos, etc. And rightly so, particularly if they're paying for a book. Why should they pay for a book that's full of grammatical errors? So try to make sure that your structure is good. Don't put too much detail in. Don't be a show off or come across as arrogant. Try not to be superficial, as we've already said. Don't go off topic and off theme for hours on end or pages on end. Don't be unrelatable, as I said earlier, ultimatum. And don't hide your mistakes. People actually want to learn from your mistakes. Some tips that you might want to include an introduction if it's relevant. Name your chapters preferably rather than just number them, because in a memoir or an autobiography, that's quite important because people want to know what this section of the book is about. Not so important in fiction, but it is in non-fiction. Keep chapters similar lengths if you can. So if one is 2,000 words, try and keep the others at 2,000 or just above or just below. Try not to have one chapter that's 500 words and another one that's 3,000 words, and don't make them infinite. Again, one of the biggest mistakes I made in my very first attempt was I had one really long chapter. In fact, I read it a few years later when I was a much better writer. And I thought, oh my word, how do people work their way through that? And I actually had to, I threw half of it away. So keep them similar lengths. Try and conclude the book when it comes to an end. Choose a catchy title, as we've already said. And we haven't even touched on book covers. So if you are writing to sell your book, you want a good book cover. But that's for another session entirely. And I could go on all day about book covers. but I'm not going to because I don't want this video to be infinite. You will need an editor if you're not used to writing. So you can use a structural editor who will pick it apart, throw it back at you in pieces and say, that's not relevant, bring this all in here. So you probably need a structural editor. That's the most expensive form of editing. Failing that, you could go for a line editor, which literally goes through it line by line, and they might say, well, that doesn't fit there, or it needs to be further forward or in another chapter, or you've already said that 3 times above. Do people really need to know it again? Only if you're reading the Bible, when it's something really important, does God say something 3 times. So unless you think you're writing something that's that important for life, try not to repeat yourself again and again and again. And your word count for a memoir, in case you were wondering, is between 40 and 90,000 words. So I think with all that said, it's probably time for me to conclude this video. So decide on the theme that you want to use if you're writing a memoir, and this is really how to write a memoir rather than how to write an autobiography, which is a different thing. Decide whether you're writing for a small or a larger audience. Make sure if you're including historical facts that you do your research. Do a mind map or brainstorm yourself to get all those chapters into some form of cohesive order. It doesn't matter if they're higgledy-piggledy when you come up with it. And it doesn't matter necessarily if you write it from the beginning to the end. You can write each, because chapters are subject focused in a memoir, you might remember something better than something else. You might want to start with that chapter, and that might help you with earlier chapters. So you can move chapters around later on. But if you're the sort of person who starts at A and finishes at Z or Z, then do start from the beginning. Plan what you're going to write. It's really important that you plan it, that you don't just throw it all together. With some writing, fiction in particular, you can what they call pants, where you use the creative side of your brain. But in terms of writing a memoir, you really need structure. Otherwise, it's going to go off topic and people will find that boring. Use a chapter grid if you can, and then decide on your publishing vehicle. Decide whether you are just going to leave it on a memory stick for people, or if you're writing it by hand, heaven forbid. But if you are that type of person and you want to write it by hand, put that manuscript away somewhere, that's fine. If you think your story is so fascinating that you want to go down the traditional publishing, looking for an agent route, then that's possible too. You can even, if you wanted to, pay a ghostwriter to write your story for you. It won't be cheap, but there are places that do that for you, where you pay and they get a professional writer to put it into words for you. There's one called Storyteller. I think the books that they produce are quite short, and really, if you're thinking that you might want to sell it in the future, it does need to be a minimum of 40,000 words, preferably somewhere around 50 or 60, and it can go up to 90,000 words. So, or decide, do you want to self-publish it? Many people, including yours truly, have self-published their books and are doing very well. But whatever you do, if you decide you're going to write that memoir, you're finally going to do it, or you're even going to write an autobiography. Maybe I'll do a full one on an autobiography, but more or less, autobiography is the same, but it's not the same because you do from the beginning of your life. And if you want to publish it, I would suggest that unless you're famous, don't write an autobiography. But if you want to leave an autobiography for family, then by all means, write an autobiography. Good luck and happy writing. I hope this has inspired you to write your own memoir. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week in the All Things Book Show.